get started on this exercise, you should have downloaded the Custom Brushes Adobe Illustrator file. Let's open it up and show you how I've got this document set up. First off, you'll notice that there's two parts to the document. This first artboard on the left has a variety of different little pre-made icons, textures, and artwork that we're going to turn into different kinds of brushes. The area that's on the right is intended for you to test out your brushes and give you a good clean space. One warning that I want to give you before you get started: be careful about erasing away everything as you start to work. You don't want to accidentally erase away all the parts that are on this left-hand side. If you do, you'll either need to undo or you'll need to open up and download another copy of this so that you can get these little bits of artwork. Next, let's select our paintbrush tool. This is the tool. It could be nested with your blob brush, but the paintbrush is what we're going to be creating and be working in. Go ahead and set your fill color to be none, and for now we're just going to keep the stroke at black and 1 point. We'll be changing up some of these a little bit later on. Also, let's go to our Appearances panel. We'll go up to Window, down to Appearance if you don't see it already, and in the Appearance panel, open up your appearance options and make sure that New Art has Basic Appearance is unchecked. This way, whenever we work in creating our strokes, all of our strokes will look consistent. The other palette that we need to have open is our Brushes panel. If you don't see the brushes, by the way, this is what the icon looks like. You can always, again, go up to Window and select Brushes and make sure that it's open. For this one, I'm actually going to click and drag it out so I can work with it. We'll close everything else out later. Also, we're going to need to have our Color Swatches panel open. So select your swatches. I'm going to drag it off and have it open. I'm actually going to dock it down here at the very bottom. Also, before we begin, let's get rid of all of our basic brushes that we're not going to be using. To quickly and easily do this, go up to the Brushes panel, Options, and choose Select All of the Unused Brushes. This is going to highlight all of the basic unused brushes, and when you click the trash can icon, it'll give you a little warning saying, "Are you sure?" We'll say yes, and this will delete away everything except these two basic default brushes. Those will always stay on there, so it's okay to keep those in here. From here, we're going to be creating our own set of brushes. To create a new brush, let's go back to our Brushes panel and click on the New Brush icon at the bottom right. This will give you an option for the different kinds of brushes that you can create. Right now you can see a couple of them are grayed out because we can't create those from scratch. But we're going to take these one at a time and then add on to it as we move forward. First, let's do a calligraphic brush. With that one selected, we'll say OK. And this will open up the calligraphic brush options. Now, with all of these calligraphic brushes, there's no one thing I'm wanting you to do. I want you to create 3 different styles of calligraphic brushes and make sure they're well named and that you're playing around with the different options. So for instance, let's say I wanted to make a good flat calligraphic brush. To do this, we can change the roundedness of our brush by clicking and dragging, and you can see how it becomes flatter, all the way down to being just a solid straight line. And we can also change up the size of our brush. Now the size of the brush is going to be difficult to determine just based on the little preview that they give you. This is why I often do a little preview or a test line before I create a new brush. This way I can see what it looks like. But for now, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it and set it to be about 20 points. Again, there's no specifics that I'm looking for. I'm just playing around with it at this time. Also, let's change up the angle of it. The angle can rotate all the way around from 180 to negative 180. And you can see again the preview that's turned on here. The final thing that you can play around with for your calligraphic brushes, if it's enabled, is by clicking on the drop-down menu and changing up some of these based on the pressure that you're working in. Now keep in mind, depending on the kind of drawing pad you have, this may or may not be enabled. So I'm not requiring you to change up this based on the pressure, but you can keep it at fixed if you don't have any of these other options. For now, I'm going to keep this fixed, but let's say I wanted to change the size of it based on pressure. Whenever you change something based on, not random, excuse me, pressure on this, you'll get a variation. Now in Illustrator, they do something kind of funny. The variation simply means how much more or less from the original. So in this case, if it has a variation of all the way up to 20, this means you can see the difference. It'll go all the way down to 0 for 0 pressure. It'll go all the way up to 40 for the most amount of pressure and everything in between. So 20 is actually the midpoint that we're working in. So you can vary up the amount of pressure and how large or small it can be. But in Illustrator, the maximum amount of pressure is the maximum amount of variation that you're giving it. So if I wanted to save this up, I'm going to call this a flat angled with size pressure. We'll say OK to this. Now let's test out our brush. You can see that it adds the new brush to your brushes panel, and I can click and drag and see what that looks like. Real light pressure to thicker pressure, and it's looking pretty good. To quickly erase away all of this, I'm going to hold down my Command key, and you can see how it swaps over to my black arrow selection tool. Now I can click and drag and delete everything away. I want you to create 2 more calligraphic brushes. So very quickly, I'm going to open up my new brush, create a calligraphic brush, and again, play around with the options for this. Maybe for this one, I'm going to make it super flat, really large. Let's go 50, 55 pixels, and I'm going to do a vertical one. Flat, vertical. Do be sure to be very descriptive in your name so that you get an idea of what it looks like. We'll say OK to this. Notice when you get larger brushes, it will give you the size of the brush in your little preview icon. Now with that, let's test it out. This gives me a calligraphic brush that looks like this, nice and vertical. Select them all, deselect. Let's make one more calligraphic brush. For this one, again, make it set to here. Maybe I'm going to have the angle change up based on the pressure. So we'll let it go all the way from one way to the other, and we'll let the size be nice and large. And I say OK. Now with this one, whenever I draw, based on the pressure, you can see it's going to change up the angle. And that's kind of a unique little thing. May or may not use that more often than not, but it changes up based on the pressure that I'm giving to it. We'll select that and deselect. I did make a mistake with that. I didn't give it a name. So at any time, if you need to make a change to a brush, you can always double click on it. This will bring up the brush options, and then you should be able to change up the options inside of this brush. So I'm going to call this brush my flat, or let's do semi-rounded angle pressure. And we'll say OK to that. Now that's added to there. Next, let's make some bristle brushes. Again, return to your brushes panel and create a new brush. Inside of here, we'll choose Bristle Brush as our option and say OK. As with the others, this gives you some different kinds of options and a little preview to show you what the bristle brush looks like. Also, as with the calligraphic one, you can create these from scratch. And all I want you to do is to create 3 different kinds of bristle brushes. First off, of course, you can give it a name, but you can also choose different kinds of shapes. Some of these are rounded in texture, and some of them are a bit more flat. Once you choose the kind of brush that you like, let's say I wanted to do the rounded angle one. Again, you get a preview of it. This is where we can start to change up the settings for these. Each one of these will give you different results based on whatever you have selected. With that done, we'll say OK. Now with my drawing pen, I can select it and get an idea. You can see how it's giving me a preview of it, and when I let go of the line, it actually fills in with all of the details. So if that's one that I like, again, we can double click on it to make changes to it. Maybe I want this one to be a little bit larger. We'll say OK to that. Notice that when I said OK to this, I still had some strokes or some lines on my already on my document. When I made changes to those strokes, it's giving me an error saying, hey, what do you want to do with those strokes now that you made a change? Do we want to leave them the same, or do we want to apply those changes? Let's apply the changes. With that done, you can see how that changed up the new strokes that were already painted. And that'll give me a larger thing to choose from. So let's delete these away, and we'll keep this one. For this one, I want you to create 2 more brushes. When you create these bristle brushes, all that I'm looking for is that you have at least one brush that's very stiff and opaque, kind of like painting with acrylic, and have one brush that's very light and transparent, kind of like painting with watercolor. So if I had to create an opaque one, we'll choose a bristle brush. And for this one, I'm just going to play around with the different kinds of brushes. Let's do a flat brunt one. Again, we'll change up the size of it. I'm looking for my preview to be very, very opaque and very thick. So here's my painting opacity. We'll pull that up. That's very opaque. Maybe bring it down just a bit. And I want it to be a very stiff kind of brush. So for this one, we're going to let the bristle length be very short and the density be a little bit tighter. And a very rigid brush. Now the more rigid it is, obviously it's getting a little bit more opaque, or excuse me, transparent looking. So I'm actually going to let those be a little bit more flexible until I can get a thicker line. So this is what I'm looking for as far as a acrylic style brush. We'll say OK to that. We'll click and drag, and you can see that gives me some really good looking little lines. Every once in a while you get little errors when using these kinds of brushes. So sometimes they work a little bit better than others. But for the most part, they give you some really cool results. Now let's create a bristle brush that mimics watercolor a little bit better. Again, create a new one, a bristle brush. Choose whatever style brush that you want to work in. I'll do a fan one this time. We'll let the size be relatively large. And I'm wanting my brush strokes to be nice and transparent. So I'm going to bring this down just a bit. And we'll keep everything looking nice and light. So this is what I'm looking for a watercolor style. We'll say OK to this. When I paint, now these brush strokes are looking much more like watercolor than a thick acrylic style of painting. And this looks really, really good, especially if I wanted to paint hair or something like this. We can select that and delete those away. One thing I forgot to do for each one of these is add a name to them. So make sure to go back once you finish. We'll call this my watercolor. We'll double click. We'll call this my acrylic. And this one, we're just going to call it Ben's test brush. It's always good to get into a habit of naming each of your tools that you have. Now let's create a set of scatter brushes that give me both a stippled and a crosshatch feel. This is where we're going to be using the different artwork that I've already given to you. To get started with a scatter brush, you need to have some sort of artwork already established. And for the most part, you can turn anything into a scatter brush. So what I'm going to do is select these stippled dots, and we're going to turn this into a stippled brush. With those dots selected, let's go over to our brushes panel, and let's create a new brush. Notice now, because I have some artwork selected, all of my other options are now turned on. The one that we want to create is going to be a scatter brush. We'll say OK to this, and this will give us a starting point for creating our brush. Now, before I do anything, I'm going to call this my stipple brush, and I'm simply going to say OK to it. Notice that when it's created, scatter brushes are added to the top of your brushes panel. And let's go over here and test out our brush that we've already created. So again, grabbing my brush tool, and I'm just going to draw a single curving line. And this is what the brush looks like. Essentially, all it's doing is repeating that artwork over and over and over again along the line that we've created. If I select it, there you can see the vector line that's been drawn. With that line already drawn, let's go back to our panel, double click on it, and open up our brush. Now I can turn on preview, and any changes that I make to this brush, you can see those changes along the line that you've already drawn off. So this way you can get a feel for what the brush is doing as you make those changes. So I want this to look like a more natural, random stippling effect. Some of the things that I'll change up is going to be my spacing. As far as the spacing goes, this is where I can click and drag it down a little bit. You can see it will bring it inward as they're getting closer together. Or if I dragged it upward, you can see how it's going to space it out even more. So in my case, I'm going to bring my spacing in just a bit to have them overlapping. As far as the size goes, maybe I'll keep everything nice and fixed at the same 100%. Scattering will allow you to go off the line a little bit. And again, if you go negative, it's going to go below the line. If you go positive, it's going to go above it. As far as scattering goes, you could turn this to random. And this is where you can let it go a little bit below the line and a little bit above the line. So it goes back and forth this way. So in my case, maybe I'm going to set it to be negative 20 and we'll do positive 20. So I don't want it to go too far from the line. Again, negative 20 to positive 20%. And the rotation will allow you to rotate everything around. Again, I'm going to set this to be random. Let's have my dots go from positive 180 to negative 180. This way they can rotate all the way around. It gives me a full 360 of my dots. The final thing I want to do is to change up the color of this. By now, if you keep it just at the same colorization method, it's going to stay whatever color that you already have this established as. However, if I want to be able to change this up, I need to change up my method. The best colorization to use is simply to hit tints. With tints, now when I say OK, again, it's going to give you your warning. We're going to apply this to the strokes. I can select my line and change my stroke color to be whatever color I need it to be. So choosing my stroke, if I set it to red, it goes over to red, or whatever other color that you want to be able to paint with. To test this out again, now if I wanted to stipple out something very quickly and easily, you can see how it will add a set of lines, and the more lines I create, the more dense those lines are going to be. So this stippling effect looks really, really good, really, really cool. If you wanted to make another variation of this, you can double click on it and you can change up the size. If you feel like these dots are a little bit too large, you could change the size and make them slightly smaller, but you also need to change out some of the spacing and all of the other things with this. You don't have to, but that's an option that if you wanted to create a variation of this stippled brush. The other thing you could do is to select your line, and don't forget you could change your stroke at the very top and make them smaller up here as well. With my stipple brush created, let's go back over and now let's create one that gives me a hatch effect. Again, make sure your artwork is selected first, and with it selected, go to your brushes panel and let's create a new scatter brush. We'll say OK to this. For now, I'm just going to call this my hatch brush, and we'll say OK. This will give us our basic brush, and then let's go over to our test area and test out this new brush. So you can see with this one, it's again just going to repeat the artwork over and over again, but let's select the line, go back to our brushes and double click to open up the options and make sure preview is turned on to see this. Now, as with the rest of them, I do want to show you how to change up the size, spacing, and rotation. But another option I want to make you aware of is the rotation relative to. Notice that when I drew this line, all of my little hatch lines are still nice and parallel. They're all going left to right, even though my line may be curving around. Well, if I want those lines to change based on the curvature of my line, I can change this rotation relative to the page to the path. Now with it aligned to the path, you can see how the lines are curving based on the path that I have. And so that's a good option to have based on, or depending on the kind of artwork that you're working with and the kind of results that you want to be able to achieve. Now that I've set it relative to the path, let's go in and change it up to make it look more like hatching. As far as the spacing goes, I definitely need to bring it in just a little bit more to have them overlapping. And also, let's change up the rotation. Let's make the rotation nice and random, and we'll let it rotate one way and then rotate negatively the other way. Now I've got some good rotated different styles of hatched lines. We'll bring the spacing in just a little bit more. And I don't think I necessarily need to change up the size or even the scattering. I kind of like the look of those particular lines. The final thing I do want to do is change up my colorization method to tints. And we'll say OK to this. And if you get the warning, make sure to apply it to the new strokes. This way it'll show up here. Now to test this out, got some hatched effects that will allow me to easily shade this as well. With this one done, let's select it and we'll delete it away. Again, if you need to make changes to this, you can always double click on it, change up your lines, make a different variation of it, and then go from there. Now let's create a set of pattern brushes. The next set of artwork we'll do is a repeating brush that makes it look like a chain from one side to the other. The thing about pattern brushes are you don't necessarily need just artwork, but you need to have a repeating pattern that's saved within your swatches panel. The quickest and easiest way to create a repeating pattern is by selecting your artwork, so I've highlighted this middle chain, and click and drag it into the swatches panel. When you let go, you can see how that creates a swatch based on that particular pattern or whatever artwork that you had selected. Now the funny thing about this is that if you create any kind of artwork and you fill it in, it'll automatically repeat that artwork over and over again as a fill pattern. We're going to do it as a brush pattern. So with that one selected, I've added the middle chain to my pattern, to my swatches panel, excuse me. I'm going to select my right hand side. Let's add that to my swatches panel, and let's select the left hand side and click and drag it into the swatches panel there too. So with all three sides, we've got a middle, a left, and a right. Don't worry about the name for this right now. We can keep it the same for here. Let's go to our brushes panel and create a new brush. And in this case, it's going to be a pattern brush. And we'll say OK to this. Let's look at the options for creating a pattern brush. You can see that with a pattern brush, it does give you a little preview of what your artwork could look like. Before we get started, let's give this a name. We'll call it my chain brush. You can change up the size of the artwork that you have. So whenever you create your new pattern, by default, the 100% is going to be whatever artwork that you have. So you can scale it up and down, and you can change up the spacing. For now, I'm just going to keep both of those at the same default setting, 100%, and we're not going to change up the spacing for anything. What we want to be able to look at are the patterns that we've chosen. Now, the preview that it gives you shows you what it would look like if your pattern was making some turns, going straight, and also a beginning and an end. And it's going to kind of try to figure out what it thinks it should be based on the artwork that you have selected. But what we want to do is to dial in exactly what we want. So to change this up, you get a preview of what part of the line that you can add on to. In our case, you can see if I wanted this straight of a line, I can choose this pattern right here. And right now it's selected the wrong tile. So I can click the down arrow. This will show us all the different patterns, and I can scroll through here. And this is the actual pattern that I want to have. So with it selected, now you can see it's linking up and creating the correct thing. For this one, it's also by default giving me an automatically generated little corner piece. It doesn't necessarily look correct. So I'm going to click on this one, and you can see how it's auto-generated, and it will create some artwork kind of based on what it thinks is correct. We're just going to go up and select none for this one. So we won't worry about the corner pieces for this particular brush. I do want to add on a piece for the very end of our chain. So for this end, we'll select this option here, so this very last one on the right. Let's select the correct pattern. If it's the incorrect one at this one, this is where you can go up and choose the correct pattern. In this case, for mine, it'd be number 12. So that looks correct there. And finally, let's look at the end down here. The corresponding one is this one. For this one, this is where we want to choose pattern number 14. So that looks correct. Don't worry about the corner pieces. We'll deal with those in just a second. With that done, if you need to make any other adjustments as far as the spacing or needing to flip it to left or right, we won't need for this one. You can do it there. But we do want to change our colorization to tints, so I can change the color to whatever I need it to be. With that done, we'll say OK. You can see our new brush is set down here, and it gives you a little bit of a preview of the different parts of your brush. With it selected, let's grab our paintbrush tool. Now when I paint, I can very quickly and easily create a chain, and you can see how it's going to repeat that pattern over and over again, and then add on the appropriate one at the very beginning and the end of my line. If I needed to change up the color, again, let's test out the color by choosing a different stroke color. Click and drag, you can see that works well also. With that, we can erase this away. And I do see one other mistake that I accidentally made. I had this artwork selected whenever I clicked on my chain. And so you can see how it's applying that chain brush stroke to the strokes that are on there. If this ever happens to you, it's an easy fix. Simply select your artwork, go up to the stroke at the very top, and you can either set it to 0 or you can just turn your stroke color off, and that'll return your artwork back to normal. The downside to using this brush is that if I do create something with a hard edge, like a square box, and I add the chain to it, you can see how the corners don't have any artwork that's placed inside of this one. So with that one, let's create a pattern brush that does have some corner effects. Go into this artwork, we'll select this piece, and again, drag it into your swatches panel and place it there. And then select the second artwork, drag it into your swatches panel, and place it in there as a new repeating swatch. We'll go over to our work area. To our brushes panel, let's create a new pattern brush. Now you can see because I had no artwork selected that it didn't automatically populate it into here. I'm going to call this my Indian brush. And for the straight lines and the main lines that we have, which is this one here, we want to select that triangular pattern. So with this one selected, this will give you an idea of what that will look like. For these, we want to be able to add something in the corners. Now there's two different kinds of corners. There's one that goes for a right-hand turn, and there's one for the left-hand turn. So for the right-hand turn, we're going to do the same thing. We'll go down, and this is where we want to add the squarish pattern to that side. You can see how it automatically populates into there, but let's also do it to this one. So with that selected, again, choose the same pattern, and this will add it to that edge as well. For this one, we don't want to do any kind of colorization or changing to it, so we'll say OK to that. Now when I choose that pattern and I create something that looks like this, you can see how it automatically adds those to the corners. If I just choose my regular brush and paint with it, it'll give me a line that looks like this. But if I do something that has a straighter edge, it'll automatically add those to the straight edges that are there, even if it's at a different kind of angle, which I think is kind of cool. We'll delete that one away. Now, sometimes you can create artwork that's a little bit more difficult to turn into a repeating pattern. Let's say I have something as simple as looking like this, and I want to create almost a rope type effect. So with that artwork selected, we'll drag it into our swatches panel, and let's go over here and test out this new brush. So we'll create a new brush. It'll be a pattern brush, and let's select that new artwork as our basic pattern from here. Notice that there's a little bit of spacing between all of this. The reason for this is because, well, when it repeats, it's going to do it as a squared off area. And because this is at an angle, that's always going to give us a little bit of a gap in between. Now we could play around with the spacing, but there's an even much better way of doing it. I'm going to say cancel to this for now. And we're going to access the repeating pattern options for this pattern. To do that, simply double click on the swatch that you've created, And this will take us into a isolated pattern creation mode. Now that we're in this special editing mode, you can see there's a little panel that opens up, and this panel will allow you to edit and make any changes that you want to this particular artwork. You can even select it and change up colors, whatever you need to this pattern. What we want to do is to change up the spacing for this repeating pattern. To do this, turn on the automatic or the pattern tile tool. With this checked on, this gives you a little bounding box, and this will allow you to click and drag and space everything away. So notice how I can give it more or less space at the top, or if I click on it, the edges, I can space it out even farther. The fun thing is, if I click and drag it inward, I can actually bring them closer together. And that's what we want to do with this artwork. Drag it until they are just touching, and now you get an idea of what this would look like as a repeating pattern over and over again. Again, one thing I like to do is give it a little bit of room at the top and the bottom, just so that we don't see any of the other pattern spacing tiling within this area. Now that I've brought those closer together and give it a little bit of space at the top and the bottom, again, make sure this is selected on to get that option. We can save this by going up to the very top, and we'll say done. And this has changed up the spacing for this particular pattern. Now with that done, let's create a new pattern brush. With it selected, choose pattern brush and say OK. Now we can go into the straight runs, choose our new pattern, and there it is repeating over and over again from here. Pretty cool. From here, we can also change up the scaling if you think it is a little bit too small. So maybe I'll bump that up just a bit. We'll say OK to that. And as far as the corners go, this is where I'll maybe want to use one of those automatically generated corners. So we'll select this one. This will give you a preview of what it looks like. So it can either be sliced in between, or I can do an auto-generated, which kind of gets a little funky. I think in my case, I like the auto-sliced option. We've done it for this edge. Let's do it for this corner too. Again, choose auto-sliced, and it'll give you an automatically generated one from there. Again, we'll change our colorization mode to tints, and we'll say OK. Now with that selected, let's test out our brush. You can see how it repeats over and over again nicely for that. If I wanted to see what it looks like as a corner, let's choose our square, and it generates corners that look like this. With that done, now let's create a set of artistic brushes. Now, art brushes are very cool because they give you the ability to take art and stretch it out along the length of your line, and in this case, it can mimic some real-world textures. What I've given you here are some scans of different kind of brush strokes or different kind of strokes from different media, such as if I wanted to use chalk or pencils or markers, anything would work. As long as you scan it in and turn it into black and white, we can take this and vectorize it, and then from there turn it into an Illustrator brush. Now it does need to be vectorized, and the image that I'm giving you is just a basic JPEG, meaning it's made up of pixels. So what we want to do is to select this, and let's quickly turn it into some vector artwork. First, with it selected, go up to the very top and choose Image Trace. Image Trace may take just a second. It's going to look at all the light and dark pixels and automatically turn it into black and white vector art. Once it's done, the next thing we need to do is to get rid of the white that's behind it. Here's what I mean. If I was to drag this off, you can see how it's both black and white, and I don't need any of the white pixels. To quickly and easily get rid of this, let's go up to our Image Trace options, which is this icon at the very top here. And inside of our Image Trace panel, I'm going to drag it off. This is where we can play around with all of the different options for this. So one thing you may want to play around with is the threshold. If I bring it up, this is going to take my image and it's going to make it slightly darker. So if I need to pick up on more of the darker texture, or if I bring it down and make it less, it's going to pick up on some of the lighter pixels and pick up on that kind of texture. So playing around with the threshold is one thing. But underneath the advanced, this is where we can tell it to ignore white. So open up Advanced, choose Ignore White, and that'll turn all of our white pixels now into just a solid transparent area. With that done, I like what I've gotten, so let's work with this. I'll close out my options. The last thing you need to remember to do is to expand your artwork. Right now it is vectorized, but it's in a special vector that needs to be broken apart. So I'm going to expand it. With expand, it may take just a second. Now you can see, I can see all the different vector points. Let's go up to Object, and we're going to ungroup these objects. Now that they're ungrouped, I can select them. Oop, may take one more try. Let's go to Object and ungroup again. I think we got it now. Now I can select the individual brush strokes and be able to click and drag and move those over. One particular issue with this is that if you've got a really rough brush, like this one here, and you drag it off, there's still going to be some other little leftover bits that were ungrouped but still not part of this brush. So the last thing that I like to do is select the entire brush by clicking and dragging over it, then go up and group those back together. We'll choose Group, again choose this one, and we'll group that together, and do that for each of the other brushes as well. By the way, the keyboard shortcut is Command G to group brushes together. Click and drag and create a group with this one. We'll close this out. Now to create an art brush, we're going to move these back over onto the area. All you have to do is to have some artwork selected. So I'm going to select this first brush here at the top. With it selected, go to our Brushes panel and choose Brush. And let's create a new art brush. It will give you a slight preview of what this will look like based on the direction or the artwork that you have selected. And the first thing we need to do is to give it a name. So I'm going to call this my opaque acrylic brush. As with the other ones, we can change up the width based on whether it stays fixed, or you can even change it up based on the pressure if you have that set for your tablet. And there's different ways that the brush can work. By default, we want it to stretch and fit along the length of our brush that we have. So we're going to keep it at the default of stretch to fit the length of whatever line that we're creating. Do make sure, however, that the direction of this is correct. So in this case, if you want it to start here and gradually taper off, this is the direction we want it to have. However, if you had artwork that was vertical, you can change it this way, or if I wanted to start here and move this way, I can change the direction of this. We'll keep it at the default, going from left to right, and change our colorization mode to tints. So with that selected, we'll say OK. This will add the brush to the top area here. Let's test it out. So let's back out, grab our brush tool and select the brush. Now when I paint, you can see how it gives me this kind of brush effect and brush creation. If I was to select these lines, I should be able to change up the color and have them turn to whatever color that I have selected based on that mode. Now the fun thing about this is that you can also create some watercolor kind of textures too by changing up the transparency of it and even adding multiple brushes on top. So if I wanted to get a watercolor effect, let's choose two different brushes. Let's say I like this brush. So with this brush selected, I'm going to drop the opacity of it down. Opacity is at the very top. Let's bring it down to about 20-ish%. Now I can place another brush on top of it that's got another transparency. Let's choose it for this one. I'm going to drag it on top of this brush. And again, with it selected, let's drop the opacity at the top down to about 10 to 20% for this one. Now you can see, because there's two different transparencies, it gives it that kind of opaque watercolor type look that most watercolors would have. I can select the artwork and scale it down if I need to. Maybe let's create this part, let it be a little bit smaller, almost like a stroke inside of the stroke. Now, depending on the kind of transparency that you've set, it's going to get different results. Let's bring the transparency of this one down just a bit more, and also the transparency of this one down just a bit more. This is kind of something to play around with, but essentially you're taking multiple strokes. Let's do the same for this one. We'll take this one, place it on top, and you're changing up their transparency to give you different kinds of effects that you want to have. Now this looks like a watercolor kind of mark because of the transparency that I've got selected. With all of those stacked on each other, again, each one having a different transparent look and feel, select all of your artwork, so all three of those. Let's create a new brush. Up here at the top, choose a new brush. This will be an art brush. We'll say OK to that. And again, we'll give it a name. This will be our watercolor. Transparent brush. We'll keep everything by default, the width and the stretching to fit the stroke length, but we will change our colorization from none to tints, and we'll say OK to this. Now let's test out our watercolor brush. Grab your paintbrush, click and drag, and paint with this. I can see it's coming in very light simply because I still had my opacity set down to 13%. Let's bring that back up. Now when I paint with this, it's giving me some nice watercolor type looking effects. Again, you can select these and change up the color of your stroke. Excuse me, there we go. And now you can start to paint with different kinds of strokes as well, or different kinds of colors for your strokes. Since they're a lower opacity, if I wanted to bring up the opacity of it, all I've got to do is make multiple strokes in the same area, and that'll build up and slowly transition to a more opaque color. Now for this exercise, I want you to create two different opaque brushes and two different watercolor brushes. So with both of these type of textures, I've got one selected. Let's do another opaque one. I'm going to choose this option. With it selected, we'll create a new artistic brush and say OK. And again, you can play around with the different options. Maybe I don't want this to be so wide, or I'm going to change it to be my pressure, and I can let the pressure be more or less based on that size. We'll change it to tints. We'll say OK with this. Now with my pressure sensitive brush, I can choose my paintbrush, and if I wanted a real thin line or thinner to thicker, I can have that all based on the brush that I have settings for this. That looks pretty cool with that. And let's do one more watercolor brush. Remember, with watercolor, you need to be able to select multiple different bits of artwork. Looks like I had that selected too. Let's bring that back. There we go. You need to have multiple ones selected. So let's say I wanted to make a watercolor brush out of this one. So I've got it selected. We'll go up and drop the opacity of it way down. Let's take some of these other textures and place them on top of it. With those selected, you can also change up the size of the stroke. And let's bring that in just a bit too. It really depends on the effect that you're trying to go for. Make a copy of that one. Let's do another one on top of this one. There we go. With all of that selected and lower opacity, let's create a new brush, new art brush, and get a preview of what it would look like. And we'll call this our watercolor 2 brush. And we'll change our colorization to tints for this one. You play around with it. You create your own set of watercolor and opaque brushes. As long as you've got 2 of them for each different style, that's what I'm looking for this exercise. Now the last brush that I want you to create uses this flower, and this is a unique kind of artistic brush. With the flower selected, let's go over to our brushes panel and create another art brush. We'll say OK to this. Now with this brush, you can see that it's vertical in its artistic design, and so we want the starting point to be at the bottom and be able to draw up to the top. So make sure the direction goes from the bottom to the top, and we don't want this to necessarily just stretch all the way across our line that we created. If I was to keep this at stretch to fit the length of the line, we'll say OK to this. This is what it would look like. Grab my brush tool, click and drag, you can see how it's going to stretch out my flower, and that's not exactly what I want. What I really want to do is just stretch out the length of the stem and keep the head of the flower looking correct. So here's how we're going to change this up. We'll delete away these. When you create your new brush, I'm going to double click on mine. Change this to stretch between the gaps. This is going to turn on a gap area, and now I can select and drag down the area that I want it to be stretched between. In this case, I'm going to drag it down till it's below the head of the flower. And if you had any artwork at the bottom, you can also adjust that as well. But for now, we'll keep that down there. Now when I draw my line, the only thing that's going to be stretched out is this area between these two. When we say OK, now with that brush selected and I draw, you can see no matter how long I draw the line, it's only going to stretch out the line and not stretch out the flower that I have. And so this comes in handy if you need to create art that's got a lot of the same repeating things, but you only want some of it to be stretched and the rest of it not to be stretched. With that done, that's all that we had to do for this particular set of brushes. Now, in order to save your brushes and to turn this into Moodle, let's go back to our brushes panel and let's save up all the brushes that we've created. Again, you can get rid of any of the brushes that you want and you can create more brushes if you need to. But to save your brushes, go to the options at the top and choose Save Brush Library. Now, this is automatically going to open this up and place it inside of your brushes folder that's inside of your Illustrator subfolder. I want to be able to find this particular file that we're creating. So make sure you're saving it to your desktop or someplace where you can be able to find it. I'm going to call it my custom brushes, but I'm going to add my name to it. So we'll do Ivy's Custom Brushes. Now the format for these brushes is going to be in an Illustrator file, .ai. In Adobe Illustrator, all of the swatches and brushes and any other settings are usually saved in that native Adobe Illustrator file. So don't freak out if you see an Illustrator file, that's okay. We'll say save. And this Adobe Illustrator file is what you're going to upload to Moodle once you have it finished. Just make sure it's the new brushes folder that you've saved and not the original custom brushes that I gave to you as the exercise file.